Are we ready?
We are ready to go.
All right. Here we go.
So we're in?
Are we going to do a little bit of, for Pete's edification, why we're even here?
Yeah. So we could do this. We won't kick it off until we tell them why we're here. You're better at that. You're a better talker.
Right. Yeah. Well, you want us to kick us off? Want me to kick us off? Are we ready?
I think it's kicked.
We're kicked. Ooh, kicked. Kick it. Well, welcome to The Ripple Effect, a new podcast around nonprofit imperatives and the work that we do in Worcester County and the city of Worcester especially. Here next to me is my co-host, Ron Waddell, founder and executive director of Legendary Legacies. And we are joined today by our very first podcast best guest.
Yes.
Pete Dunn, who is the new CEO of Greater Worcester Community Foundation, new resident of Worcester, and new friend to the Ripple Effect podcast.
Also, a couple more things about Mr. Dunn I have here. Peter led the Central New York Community Foundation, nearly quadrupled their assets to $400 million. Annual grant ranking more than $18 million. And the staff grew by 9 to 25. All that led to an increase in scope and visibility across the region, including an endowment.
Right there. Proof in the pudding. Zoom in on that? Right there.
The endowment.
Fresh out of the bowl.
Yeah. Endowment for Say Yes Scholarship Program. So Pete brings great experience before getting here as well. And welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me and for being the first and best guest that I've had.
Yeah, this is a big milestone for the Ripple Effect. And for those of you that don't know me, I am the co-host as well, Marybeth Campbell. I'm the CEO for Worcester Community Action Council. And Pete, it will help you a little bit to know how this started and why we've invited you here today.
That would be awesome.
And why you're an important first guest on the Ripple Effect because of the work that you have done and that you are planning to do in Worcester. So we've talked about this a lot through the first few episodes of the Ripple Effect, but I think it's worth summarizing quickly what the Ripple Effect is and how it came to be. So the long story is very long, and that's episodes 1 through 4. But the short story is Ron was an employee of WCAC back in 2019. He had come from Straight Ahead Ministries through a grant called Safe and Successful Youth Initiative, working with gang-involved youth in the city. WCAC, when I came on board in 2019, then as executive director, we were the lead of that grant program. But simultaneous to Ron being an employee and his co-founder, Junito Ramos, also at that time was an employee of WCAC. They had also established Legendary Legacies on the side hustle.
It was a side hustle.
Side hustle with swag. That
was the first thing we had. That's all we knew.
Yes, Legendary Legacies. So with this idea, which has come to fruition with great fidelity and quality now and great respect in the city, is Legendary Legacies is his own standalone nonprofit with Ron as the executive director and co-founder. But we had been working through this program with a couple of partners. One of the partners decided that it wasn't the right fit for them, and we absorbed that portion of their grant at WCAC. So we were looking for opportunities to figure out how we could respond to the demand and need of participants in the program with limited capacity. And without going through all the certain level of details from every episode that we've talked about, Ron as an employee wanted to do a lot of things that weren't going to work necessarily within the limits of WCAC's boundaries as an organization. But the opportunity arose.
I'm a rule breaker.
You're
I like to push. I'm not a rule breaker,
yes.
But I push boundaries.
You like to call yourself a disruptor. Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Rule breaker. And I like to ask for forgiveness later. So we didn't break the rules at all, but I think we saw an opportunity where we were at a point of inflection with Ron and Junito as employees that were really trying to push the envelope of what they could do with the young men and some women who were in the program that for various reasons, our organization couldn't necessarily support. But Legendary Legacies was an existing nonprofit. They were doing kind of on the side, supposedly after hours and on the weekends. And, through a series of vetting questions and conversations, ultimately Ron and Junito moved on from WCAC, focused fully on LL, and WCAC subcontracted them with that absorbed contract. And for a long time, Ron and I would talk about, the partnership and how it evolved. And Ron would talk about, we have to talk about this because what we did was we used tools like subcontracting vehicles and cash flow mitigation. We advanced some funding to LL to bridge that cost reimbursement gap and, take on that risk ourselves with our unrestricted cash. And though small and, in the big picture of things was a helpful tool.
That was big to us, man. $10,000 at that time. We had like $1,500 in the bank account to get $10,000. Game changer.
And Ron we would talk all the time about, we have to talk about this. We should talk about the different nuances and the different tools and the vehicles we use to keep this going and all the work. And I was always like, no, like I don't know. Why do we need to talk about it? We just did it. Fast forward to this past year in particular, in terms of some of the challenges both of our organizations have experienced just with issues of things like cost reimbursement grants on the public side and the challenges of attracting philanthropy and even working through federal grant funding through the city like ARPA. And this very palpable conversation that's been happening in the city around sort of the inequities among different nonprofit sizes and abilities and capacity. So we kind of thought about our partnership and thought, why don't we should talk about this a little bit more about how our organization, a larger organization, triggered some tools that helped a smaller organization that now is a completely autonomous, much bigger budget, but we had a small drop in the bucket there to help push the LL path along. And if we talk about it and talk about those different pieces, can we create our own drop in the bucket in the ecosystem? WCAC as an agency and as a board have talked about this at length in terms of our role in the ecosystem of nonprofits. Can we do more of what we did with LL? But then through these kind of conversations, can we engage in incent and discussion that might attract others to do similar? Or if they're already doing it, come talk to us. So we can kind of talk about those more innovative ways to help support one another towards these common goals. So we thought about who are good guests that work in this universe and see these types of challenges. You're a new a committed resident, homeowner in the city of Worcester. So we thought, what better guest to be our first guest than you? So we're happy to have you here.
Well, identify with the ripple effect, foundations in their work, doing it well. The ripple effect is a real phenomenon there, right? Whether it's within organizations, for individuals or community at large, right? So change can happen in a variety of ways, and I like the imagery of the ripple effect. So,
and our producer Marrio has done a great job with our graphics as well. Yeah. So we appreciate Marrio.
It's ripples in it and everything.
So Pete, one of the things I was curious about off the rip was as we think about these innovative strategies, and you come in, just talk a little bit about when you were in New York. What were some of the things that this can't be the first time you've heard these types of challenges based on the resume I just read here. So just give us a little bit about in New York, maybe what you saw, kind of what you did over there.
Well, I think for philanthropy too, my job in essence, in part, is deploying limited philanthropic resources for sustainable impact, right? How do you create sustained community change over time? Sometimes it's community change, sometimes it's organizational, it can be at a variety of different levels. But limited resources, what can you do? And part of that is picking your lanes, right? If you were to look at philanthropic resources and compare them to government funding, it's staggering, the difference, right? We deploy here in Worcester County around $10 million a year. We cut 2,000 different grant checks and support hundreds of different organizations. Less than around a quarter to a third of that, we actually have control over, right? Because the rest is very designated. We follow our donor's intent, and those funds are restricted in a variety of ways. So what can we do with those funds? And we had the similar questions that we worked through in Syracuse. And I think the answer emerging in philanthropy is thinking more broadly about the tools at your disposal. So grant making is a tool, not the only tool. It's the tool that nonprofits certainly love, especially if it's multi-year general operating funds, right?
For sure.
Right. But, foundations, by virtue of the fact that they're operationally endowed, can think long-term, can act in a way that is different, both in policy spaces and with partners than grantees can, and nonprofits that are doing the physical work of of community engagement and support for residents. So what I saw, to get my long-winded way of answering your question, is that the Community Foundation in Syracuse started using other tools at its disposal. So the first one we started to pull down was data. We were very specific about if we were going to do stuff and go deeper, that we would follow data. And data, we would measure ourselves about those, where the data was, and use that as a lens to figuring out where our lane should be. Because some funders are in some spaces, sometimes they're alone, sometimes they're together, sometimes they're partnered. And then the government's doing its thing. So where should we be? So data was first. The second was, are there other ways for us to deploy financial resources other than grants in innovative ways? And in Syracuse, we started doing, for instance, loan guarantees. So we made a guarantee, $500,000 guarantee to a local affordable housing developer, nonprofit, that helped support a $5 million pool of mortgages that have today built around 50 houses in a concentrated area in part of Syracuse. That was part of our lead poisoning initiative. So 50 families are now living in Syracuse in houses, and our support, no money out of our accounts, but by just putting our credit behind this pool of mortgages, helped buy down the risk factor for the bank, made them more comfortable, and made it easier for people to get into houses. So that is, so whether you're talking about loans, loan guarantees, equity investments in nonprofit, programmatic work, those types of strategies, which are generically called impact investments in our world, are interesting opportunities for us to look beyond grant making. So the next thing that that we looked at in Foundation in Syracuse is, are there ways for us to use our intellectual capacity? So doing monographs and papers on particular issues and pushing that out, using our intellectual capacity in the place where we fit to be able to see data and see trends and see issues, to be another force for moving the conversation along outside of others in the community. That we have a perspective, that we're not necessarily just neutral, we're objective. And so using our voice. And so communications you often think of as our website and our marketing and our materials. Communications became the work, right? Especially in our equity work and a bunch of other things. And then the last thing that follows directly from what I just said is policy. Is there space to work in public policy that can help move needles down the road? Because we have a voice that's different. You know, you guys are going to have different relationships with legislators than we will.
For sure.
Right? And so I can come in and talk to them in a way that might be different and amplify your voice, especially if there's a thing that would help move us down the road in some of the things that we're funding around. So you think about all those different tools, that's a real bunch of different portfolios of work that you can build out for community impact over time.
Quickly, for some of our listeners who might have jumped in, that's like, what is a community foundation? What, I don't even know what that is. Like, what do they do?
We better, because in full disclosure, which I didn't mention, is that we are both in the board of the Greater Worcester Community Foundation.
We have to give that up. I know, but I'm just saying we have some listeners that are tuning in.
It's a good segue into disclosure.
Absolutely. See, that's why we work well. Yeah. If you had to give a snapshot of, elevator pitch on what a community foundation is.
So community foundations are, one way of thinking about community foundations is that they're foundations of many foundations under one nonprofit umbrella, focused on local place-based work. So we are not just one foundation, because we're composed of, in Worcester, composed of 600 different funds, all having a purpose that donors have defined, all donors who love this community in one way or another. And we manage those collectively. We manage the grant making. We work with the donors. And we really have two missions. The first is to grow philanthropy. It's specifically permanent funds, not just money in and money out, but money that stays and is invested. And we use a portion of it every year in an endowment kind of way to really grow permanent resources, the community savings account, if you will, to help move the community forward. So growing philanthropy is intrinsically important to community foundations and growing the pie of resources, if you will. And then the second is community change and support, nonprofit support, individual support, things that we do to help move the community forward. You know, a thing that a lot of people don't know about the Community Foundation is we're the largest scholarship provider in this region, right? manage more than 100 scholarships that do all sorts of things. We make all these grants. We do this work with kids. The community foundation is in a lot of spaces. So that's longer than an elevator speech, but that's what we do.
I want to dive into, I'm a little off script relative to these questions.
You're good.
But this is how we flow, right?
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about some of the functionality of the foundation and maybe some of your early observations in Worcester, but as compared to your time in Syracuse, and even I know you spent time doing philanthropy and engaging in California too, so it got a broad geographic perspective. One of the things you mentioned is around sustainability, and we've talked on the podcast in the earlier episodes around some of the frustration we as nonprofits face around whether it's public money or philanthropic money is this push for sustainability. Like you seed a grant, but then the nonprofit has to figure out how to sustain itself. And then that kind of sometimes juxtaposes and creates tension with this idea of oversaturation. And where do we reconcile those things?
Oh,
we're in
the whole podcast talking about that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to slice off different pieces of that, right? I'm a lawyer by training, and so every now and then I get linear, and I'll try to do that. So the first thing is saturation, right? And that's a really tough topic because on the one hand, this society is built around the notion of individual choice, freedom of expression. And nonprofits are a reflection of that, right? They're a reflection of individual values, community values that have come together to coalesce. We have the most vibrant third sector, independent nonprofit sector of any country in the world, and there's a reason for that, right? And there's a great value that has been brought to our country as a result. However, how can nonprofits themselves be sustainable over time? They are business enterprises, right? And so understanding their revenue model and the impact and expense that flows and how that all works together is an enduring question for anyone serving in a leadership role or on a board of a nonprofit. So one thing that I think is interesting that folks may not know but may intuit is we have some generational transition going on. Right. So there was a study done by a foundation in Baltimore a couple of years ago that said that over the next 5 years, 65% of nonprofit executive directors and CEOs will retire. Right. Baby boomer effect for real.
Right.
And I think we've seen that. I think the pandemic accelerated it for some people, delayed it for others. And so whenever there's a retirement, there's an inflection point for a board or for the leadership of the organization around what are we doing? Is this working? Should we be doing something differently? Should we be allied and affiliating? Do we have a sustainable model to do the work that we want to do? Do we care about preserving the mission or preserving the organization? Right. So in Syracuse, we had a strategic partnership fund. We helped facilitate more than 35 nonprofit mergers over a decade. And those organizations who came to us, right, looking at opportunities to get either preserve mission or heighten and amplify their mission in a variety of ways by affiliating. So I think there's a space for funders to help facilitate those, not to come to nonprofits and say, you guys should come together.
Yeah.
I don't think the foundations should be the matchmaker. I think that should be done organically and folks can figure out for themselves how to partner. But we can bring cash. Yeah. We can bring resources to help grease the skids. So there's a generational imperative. And then sometimes it's not the generational imperative. It's other things like the state only wants to fund so many partners across the state or the Commonwealth. I'm still getting used to the term Commonwealth.
It's only a few of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in New York State, this was a major issue because New York wanted fewer partners. So one of their rationales in like the Medicaid space, like disability serving organizations, things like that, was fewer partners. Fewer partners means more impact because we can be cheaper. So that put pressure on a lot of smaller organizations that had contracts that suddenly didn't. They became subcontractors on others' grants. But that drove a lot of questions about sustainability in their business model because they relied on these particular grants for their existence. So those are those kinds of effects too. So, and then sustainability, it's like, you see organizations with so many different revenue models, whether they're built around grants or built around philanthropy, all the different types of philanthropy, organizations that relied on events or attendance, especially in the arts and culture space, were really undermined during the pandemic and had to think, like, how are we going to preserve ourselves? So there have been all these different threats to revenue models that have led people, organizations, and leaders to think differently about, like, how are we going to sustain ourselves? But each nonprofit is a business, right? They're in the business of doing work to support the community. As a funder, it's important that we understand our partners' business models and where we fit.
So I'm going to say off the bat, one of the things we talked about on the podcast already is that we are a business, right? We're just a business with a different tax code as a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it doesn't always appear or feel that folks look at the nonprofit sector that way, that it is actually a business that we're trying to run. There are times that, especially for us as a newer nonprofit and starting out, one of the questions that I wanted to throw out was, we didn't know what we didn't know. If you're starting a nonprofit versus something like Worcester Community Action Council that's been around and to the point of oversaturation, is a matter of, hey, there's a passion for this. We see a gap. And so we're going to start this because of a passion. I'm meeting with a group of individuals even right now who are smaller nonprofits that are startup. And I just was on a call on Saturday with one of them because she's like, hey, Ron, how do you protect your programs? Right? Like I presented this to someone and then they took it and now they were doing it somewhere else. Right? And what I said to her was, sorry that happened to you. Happened to me too. This is what I've did. But without skinning my knees and banging my head on the wall, right? As a newer nonprofit, a lot of these things that you're not even aware of, working with Mary Beth and being able to kind of be under her wing for a little bit, under WCAC's wing, has given us a tremendous leg up, I would say, and even to the fact that I was able to be asked to join the Greater Worcester Community Foundation. Mm-hmm. Everything I'm learning here is tremendous, and I give back to the community. I guess what I'm getting at is, like, how do we bridge that gap between those grassroots serving nonprofits who are on the ground doing that work, where some of the larger ones get it? Like, this, I'm known for saying this. One of the things I found interesting in nonprofit work is that you can stay in compliance but not have impact. Mm-hmm. Right? Because this is what the thing tells me. This is what the grant, these are the RFP, this is what it tells me to put out. And so I put that out. But I'm not really moving the needle on anything. It just keeps this thing going on and on. So, like, how do we start to bridge that gap?
Community action is actually a very good example of that in terms of what we're asked to track. We're asked to track outputs, counts of services. We're never asked what happens as a result of that service.
That's it.
We tend to value that. So right. we're doing that. Right. But our funder doesn't actually ask us that question.
Same here before you go, Pete. That's what we did. We invested a big portion of our funds that we were blessed from Blue Cross Blue Shield to be able to build our own CRM, because the external ones that we had for the grants we were reporting on didn't speak to the impact we wanted to. And so we needed to build our own internal to be able to speak to those things. So
yeah, it's almost like a catch-22, mm-hmm. right? Because if you're in compliance, you're not having impact. But if you're out of compliance, you're dead.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Right.
So what do you do? I think that it's worth noting that the model that you guys experienced, which in nonprofit philanthropy land is called fiscal sponsorship, is a really great way forward. So people who are social entrepreneurs who have ideas like your friends, being able to affiliate with a partner, like a trusted partner,
right,
and move it forward like you did, and then be able to, prove it up, and then get to a point where, we could sustain this. We can go off on our own now, understanding what comes with going off on your own, which includes all the, the board and the tax filings and all the, stuff that you have to be accountable for if you're going to go down that road. But I think fiscal sponsorship is a definite thing. I know people often want to have their own thing, but we encourage here, and we encourage in Syracuse, that if folks are like super entrepreneurial and thinking about that they've got an idea to have impact, but first, look for partners, because we think you can go farther along rather than trying to reinvent the wheel necessarily. That's not always going to be the case, but I think it's a great option.
You just mentioned the word trust, and I think we've talked a lot about that too, of how trust might be defined and maybe distorted a little bit because, for example, WCAC, highly governed, highly compliance-oriented organization. As a result, we have tons of process and structure and governance and fiscal operations. I'm confident we do a good job, but as we have received funding in the past, this SSYI grant as an example, because my predecessor was a trusted individual, not necessarily because we owned the expertise in the work. And what has led and transpired over time with this particular project that started our partnership is we've now moved away from the lead of that because we've acknowledged we're not the best at this piece of it. Another organization ought to take hold. And it's transpired in many different ways.
That's continuing to move.
Yeah. But I think trust is an interesting, how trust is defined through the lens of various diversity of funders, but public in particular. Trust-based philanthropy, I think, has helped shift the market a little bit. And I think Greater Worcester has been, with COVID and especially the Worcester Together funds, I think we're a great step in that. And there's good partnership there. And I know other foundations have done that too. But you're also new to the community too. So how do you define that and look for, and how do you expect people to trust your approach and leadership in this new community? The hard-hitting questions of the ripple effect.
Well, I know. So I've been pretty candid about it. I'm the fifth CEO of the Community Foundation in 5 years, right? And I've said to the board in the search and during the search process that my objective for at least the first 2 years is confidence building across all constituencies, right? From donors to folks on the front lines in community, and to be accessible and just be myself and just be out and talk to folks, and also remind them that there's more than one Peter Dunn in the community.
That's right. There's two out here.
And that I'm the Pete and he's Peter. Anyway, so, but really is just to be accessible and be out and see people and re-engage. And that re-engagement is amplified by the fact that he had a pandemic in the middle of it, and then we've had some leadership change. So, and I've had great response in my 10 weeks here so far. Folks have been super welcoming, and I'm getting more and more insight into the 1 degree of separation that exists between any two people.
Right. That's it. Welcome to Worcester.
Yeah, which is not that different than Syracuse.
Yeah. Gotcha.
But intense nonetheless. So, but yeah, so it's for me, it's about, somebody said to me, they trust you when they get sick of you.
What does that mean?
Because it's like you around so much.
I'm tired of seeing you.
I'm tired of seeing you. Okay, you're fine.
You're good.
Yeah. So part of it's like saturation and just being in a lot of different places so that people, but what I've heard is that there's an enduring well of affection and support for the Community Foundation. We've been a profoundly resilient organization. We're 50 years old almost. And so there's a lot to build on, right? And so so that is a superb place from which to build more.
So I'm gonna follow it up with this then. As a newcomer, in your 10 weeks you've been here and doing your research before you came in, what were some of the most striking aspects or surprises you've encountered in the Worcester nonprofit ecosystem since you've kind of been here?
So there's both stuff that's been surprising and other things that are common to the experience of legacy cities, I think, across the United States. So the things that are common, I come from a hilly city that has had some of its best economic days behind it. Hasn't come as far back economically as Worcester has, is maybe 10 years behind economically, but has colleges on its hills, a highway running through neighborhoods that used to be thriving that now are covered with a highway.
That's familiar.
All in the same places that were redlined. So there's those kinds of commonalities that I'm not surprised by, but I do come from the place that Syracuse has the highest rates of childhood poverty in the country, has the highest incidence of...
They have the highest rate of childhood poverty in the country?
Yes.
In Syracuse?
Yes.
I don't think people would believe that, but that's the facts.
That's facts. And then another fact that's also dispiriting is Syracuse has the highest levels of geographic concentration of poverty among Black and Latino populations in the country. Part of that's geography, part of it's redlining, part of it's where the highways went. There's a bunch of reasons. But those sorts of things have also lead to all sorts of, we've got all these issues with violence and with evictions and lead poisoning and so forth in Syracuse. So I'm coming from a city that is just making the turn now economically and is on the verge of ultimately having what we have here in Worcester now in terms of an affordable housing crisis, right? So Syracuse isn't there yet, but the quality of the housing is so crappy that you've got all these other issues because the economics of housing in particular in the city have been upside down. Now, just in the last week, you asked me about things that I've noticed. So I had breakfast with a state legislator in the Pleasant Street neighborhood. And one of the factoids that she mentioned is that...
Did you go to the Pickle Barrel?
I did go to the Pickle Barrel.
Yes, you met Gus.
I didn't want to do an advertising.
You met Gus. We go there every Saturday. My boys know Gus.
You have to mention the Pickle Barrel.
Yeah.
So liked the Pickle Barrel, but I was getting we were talking about a whole bunch of different things, and the statistic that was pretty powerful was that in that particular neighborhood on both sides of Pleasant Street down to Main South, only 8% of folks only 8% of residences are owner occupied. Mm-hmm. So 92% of folks are renters.
Right.
And that's actually gotten worse. It used to be 10%. So that was like, yeah. I mean, I've heard multiple stories about affordable housing and, triple deckers getting flipped and folks being evicted and the impacts of those issues on folks looking for housing in places other than Worcester they're priced out. And then the day after that, I think I went to the public library downtown. This lovely new building downtown. They've done a marvelous job on it. One of the things that was surprising to me was that they've had a dozen opioid overdose incidents in the library so far this year.
Happens all the time. I used to work at the library. Yeah. I never knew that, but yeah.
So I'm just thinking about, there's so many different layers to process that, right? But just think if you're a staff person, you're a librarian, you went for information science, other duties as assigned, learning how to use Narcan.
Right.
Yeah. And remarkably interesting, thoughtful approach, partners with other organizations, thinking about their physical space, how to keep people safe, all sorts of different issues in a space that's for learning, right? So those are just like two little factoids.
No, those are huge. Those are huge. One of the things that, for me, you said Syracuse is not yet where Worcester is, but maybe 10 years behind. And I would imagine 10 years ago, people were saying that here in Worcester. And so
we said we were the Brooklyn of the 90s. That's what we said.
Oh, I wasn't here.
It was the Paris of the 80s.
Paris of the 80s, wow. Brooklyn of the early 2000s.
Okay, yes. All right. Well, so for instance, I was recently at a city council meeting, and I went to talk, and the affordable housing thing was challenged, and we're trying to figure that out. But one of the things I'm saying is, as you alluded to the fact that Syracuse is not yet here, with no anticipation that this is what's coming down the line. And so then what do we do as a nonprofit sector to address that before it gets here? And then it's, now we've got to do something because this is the itch that I have to scratch now because it's so bad.
Can I just add on to that question a little bit? Because I think the last episode, you and I talked about nonprofits responding to need in some way. The pressure of whether or not we get cost reimbursed or not, we're going to deliver. And we use, in this instance, it was a housing example, but mostly related to the Haitian demand of Haitian migrants, and just the pressure that's pushed on nonprofits in terms of, you're going to do it anyway.
Right. I feel like they play on, that piece was like they play on our good
a little bit
nature.
It's like a sort of sycophant kind of weird. But with your question in terms of anticipation,
right,
but also adding in the role of the community foundation and you mentioned policy as kind of a pillar and lever that you've focused on in Syracuse. Where does the foundation lead versus follow in those policy arenas and bring along the nonprofit sector?
So there are examples of foundations that have been active in the policy space here locally. The Health Foundation, as is one of its primary goals, using policy to affect change, right? If you looked down the pike in at the Boston Foundation, they have a whole policy shop, right? And they're right next to Beacon Hill, and they're up there all the time talking about stuff. I wouldn't be surprised if a bunch of them are registered lobbyists as a result.
I was one of them.
Yeah, there you go. So in particular, when you think about like the Boston Foundation, large, billion plus sized foundation, active in those types of issues. I think when you think about our scale and our place-based focus, it's a little bit different. And I come from a place that also had the issue of New York City drove the bus.
Sure.
Right? And upstate cities resented the crap out of New York City as a result. And so you had to think about, from a policy perspective, if downstate's running the bus, either you make allies with folks in the city or you're doing your own thing on a local basis.
Sure.
And do stuff and pivot off of things that are perhaps more local. And so for a funder, it's picking your lanes, right? What makes sense? We will not be a foundation that takes policy positions on everything. It will be rare. And when we do it, we'll go deep on it. And so the policy position work that we did in Syracuse was fundamentally around housing, specifically lead poisoning, because we had a lead poisoning crisis in Syracuse. So that involved a city ordinance, involved allies on the city council and with the mayor, involved engagement with our county executive and county legislature, all sorts of things. But that was fundamentally very local based. But it helped generate additional resources from the state and the federal government and do a whole bunch of other things. So that's a story around picking your lane, figuring out where you can provide some enduring momentum. Sometimes it might not even be policy, it's storytelling.
Right.
Right. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I'm hoping that we build out here is the capacity to tell stories better. We're building out a communications staff. And but for us in Syracuse, being the place that told the story about lead was powerful.
You led that. Yeah, we were the voice.
We were the voice around lead poisoning.
Right.
We also devolved power and gave power to folks in community or trained folks on how to tell a story. And so it wasn't necessarily just about us and our storytelling, but our capacity. We had communications capacity that we could deploy. So that's an overlooked tool, but an example of policy.
Did you make a lead joke there? Were you trying to make a lead joke?
I wasn't.
Straight face, because I know that look too.
We led with lead. Yeah.
I know you were trying. Don't deny it. You cannot deny it at this point. It's episode 5.
I was supposed to stay straight with this pirate shirt on. Today. This is throwback to what, episode 3?
Episode 3. I was wearing this shirt. And I mentioned that I felt a little Seinfeld complex about it, and then you ran with it.
Yeah, I bought a shirt
in the spirit of allyship
Absolutely.
And some symmetry. I chose to duplicate my outfit today just for you.
And we didn't let Peter know, or Peter would have rocked one, right? Pete, you would have.
Well, you told me to come armed with a dad joke, and now that you're wearing this shirt, I've got a new one.
What do you got? What do you got?
Where does the king keep his armies?
King, you know this one?
Probably something near his leggies.
Up his sleeveys.
La la la.
Didn't see that one. He was ready to go with his dad joke as well. I appreciate that.
You didn't see the team meeting that we had yesterday where I said I have to come prepared with a dad joke, and so that resulted in
oh my gosh!
It was like the best team leadership meeting ever.
Well, you have Jonathan Cohen on your team, so I can only imagine the things that were coming. He is the king of memes. I don't know if you've experienced the sharing of memes yet, but
but all seriousness, I would say before we talk about technology, as technology has advanced over the last 20, 50 years, I have to say that a whiteboard is the most remarkable. Would you agree with that?
I've never used one, so
it's remarkable. It's remarkable. Remarkable.
Oh God,
that's deep. That's so multi-layered.
Sometimes you have to really think about it.
It's remarkable.
It is. You see the struggle as it's happening, and then
it gets there.
Oh man!
You mentioned this a little while ago, like being able to kind of you didn't say this, I'm putting words in your mouth, but in my head, either get in line and march with the folks that are leading it or doing it or do things on your own. Do you think that ever can shift? And if I mischaracterized what you were trying to say, Pete, please correct me. But do you think that can ever shift where it is more the external saying, hey, this is what's needed? Because I feel like as we've kind of gone through these equity conversations and all this, it's like, we need to hear lived experience. We need to hear from the voice, the people that are there doing it. But there's still this overarching like, well, what's this entity over here really want to do? And are they moving away from that when really maybe what's still needed on the ground?
Oh, there's so many layers. There's another thing you could draw all sorts of layers around. So one is around how funders act together, right? And in my experience, there are occasions when funders do their own thing, and then sometimes they do it with allies, other funder partners or others. And by do my own thing, I mean that they're the ones who are kind of like pushing maybe with partners, but maybe not other funders, right? Because there's like inter-funder dynamics. And then like we've had examples, we have multi-funder collaboratives, lots of examples of them in my time in Syracuse. However, the issue that you also refer to is the notion of power sharing and devolving power and things like that. And we had some interesting examples of that. Like in our lead poisoning work, we decided, we made a $2 million commitment around the issue, and we were giving out maybe $350,000 a year in grants and doing some other things, and mostly around direct window and door remediation in small landlord-owned properties to reduce friction surfaces where lead sloughs off.
Oh, wow.
So we were doing that in concentrated geographies. But one of the things we were like, the voice of moms and the voice of dads and parents in particular in the community is really powerful and getting louder, and we were helping in that space. I was like, well, what if we let the community decide? So we said we're going to do $150,000, and we're looking for community partnerships who want to do a creative thing with those funds to help move the community forward around the issue of lead. And we did a bunch of convenings, very difficult stuff, parents bringing their voice, they've got kids who've been poisoned,
wow.
And we had the right staff and the right partners, and we were doing this, and as a result of that, some natural partnerships came together. And there were 5 funding opportunities, and we put it out to a vote, and we had several thousand votes, online votes come in. And one group ran, and I think it was a group of Black doulas. And I think Black moms who were supporting moms in pregnancy. And they had a whole approach to approaching it early and around the housing experience of moms who are expecting. Something like $150,000.
Yeah.
But we didn't decide.
Right. Shout out to the doulas. Doulas are amazing. It's underrepresented. Like
totally, it's a totally awesome
underused resource.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
Yeah, and there are lots of examples of these networks of folks in those spaces that are powerful to help move needles. But so we learned a lot, right? It was a lot of work. Communications was enormous, right?
So that communications piece right there, Pete, if I could jump in, because that being able to coalesce and bring that together, and you alluded to it quickly, you're like, there's these kind of funder dynamics, but there's same things happen in the nonprofit sector too. Like, well, right? I think one of the cool things that me and Mary Beth have been able to do is develop a relationship to a point where, really, there was this grant that she was going to apply for. She's like, well, wait a second. I'm going to apply for it. I saw you guys applied last year. I just want to make sure I'm not infringing. No, you're good. Go ahead and do it, right? The ability to, this is kind of 2-layer too. I don't ever ask one question. I always got double-barreled. But the ability to think like that, what wisdom would you share on how to develop that? And then what points or what things stick out in your experience that really would support that type of trust building and coalition building, especially with communication, obviously?
I mean, I am not sure, to be honest with you, because
that's real.
Number one, I haven't been in that space. I've been in the funder ecosystem for 30 years, right? So I haven't sat in your shoes, number one. Number two, when I think of trusted partner, I don't think of externally trusted partner. I think of mutually trusted partner, right? Like you guys trust each other, as opposed to other people might trust WCIC. But you're new, so they're not so sure about you.
Right.
So that kind of thing.
Right.
But I think it's relationship building, and and there's this, you prove trust but through experience over time. And but since I'm not sitting in the shoes of a organization providing service, it's hard for me to
Yeah, I mean,
be in that space.
we didn't. I mean, we had our bumps. As we've said before, we've agreed never to text each other about work related things.
Yeah, we read into those with our own biases and lenses and tones.
Yes.
What did you just say?
Yeah, but it is really. I agree. It is relationship building. I think the challenge. I just had a 3-hour conversation with a nonprofit executive director of a small nonprofit who's just struggling with the optics of the level of funding that they're getting for their work versus the time it's going to take to actually execute use of those funds for the ultimate objective, which is a capital infrastructure campaign. And in the meantime, trying to soothe and solve relationships by, in some ways, diluting their ultimate objective because they're now focused on the short-term programs and services that one person has the capacity. It doesn't even have the full capacity to do all these things, but trying to manage relationships and build trust, getting to ultimately get to this 2-year goal. And I think that's the challenge. In Worcester, as you alluded to, Worcester is a small community, second largest city in New England, but 1 degree of separation.
Always.
And I think there's some fear too. I think there's a lot of fear in, sharing and opening out of concern for
I think
duplication.
I think part of that also, in my opinion, though, being here for a little bit, is that folks look at this, they have limited views on the funding. You're a lot of times fighting over pieces of the pie when there's more, there's other desserts on the table, right? Like, don't just say, like, even specifically in the youth violence space, that's the space I know.
Yeah.
The dollars that come into Worcester are limited, $700,000 between these two. And so then that makes it really hard for folks to come into that work because now we're trying to figure out how do we divvy up this $700,000 when, in my opinion, there are a lot other funding opportunities to fund this type of work beyond that $700,000. And so being able to think more creatively, develop relationships in Worcester and outside, to think like, where else can there be funding that comes in to help support this and support our work where we're not just fighting over the same small batch of resources. I think this in the great book, Poverty by America, they talk about this idea of this resource scarcity that they put out there that really doesn't exist, right? So I'm gonna put you against them. It's either our veterans or our young people struggling here, when really there are plenty of resources out there to address all of it. So,
or around the theme of saturation too, it's this organization that does this or this organization that does something similar or the same thing. And to your point, Pete, is that you're not going to these organizations as a funder being like, you guys have to work together.
Sure.
But someone wins and loses often in those. And is that a result of that organization has a better grant writer versus the other one? Are they a little ahead of the curve on data? Do they have a little bit more capacity? And I don't think I don't think that the picking should result in winners and losers per se, but where do we identify in the inequity of the ecosystem access to capacity building? We've talked about this around like social media and spending $5,000 on.
Oh yeah, I did that. Data. I did that my first year. So yeah, there was an outside entity that were like, we can market you and get your name out there. So I paid $5,000 to this entity, and then when I got the data, I showed a friend of mine who was in data analytics, and I was like, look, what do you think? And they were like, you could have spent $250 on Facebook ads and got the same results. Yeah. It was like, oh.
Yeah. I think community foundations have universally done a lot of nonprofit capacity building. And I think there's room for more of that here. But there is also an element that I think is led by perceptions of trust it has created some inequities in our own ecosystem here that I think the light was shown a little bit through the ARPA process, that there is a palpable frustration with access to resources for smaller, zip code street level nonprofit, like, street by street type of nonprofits with niche expertise, as opposed to the WCACs or the larger institutions in the city.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like I'm not quite clear on where funders might be able to help. You've got a cash flow issue, you've got sophistication issues in terms of compliance. There's a bunch of things in there, and maybe funders like Community Foundation could be helpful. But I also know we're not loan underwriters, right? And so if we were ever going to be active in that space, we'd want to do it with a partner that has experience. And then you've got layers of partnerships and whatnot. But there's so much money floating around, and it'd be nice if more folks had access to it. It is a little bit inscrutable. Yeah, right? You can. There's lots of folks who have expertise around ARPA issues that aren't me.
Yeah. Yeah, for another time. But so for listeners that may not even be from Massachusetts, right? Like the way that we chose to do the ARPA funding here was our city took it, they created a couple pools, and then they kind of oversaw the distribution of the funding. So folks are working for that.
I mean, I reference ARPA, but that's just one example of where there are challenges in access to resources and immediate barriers for some organizations to access resources of any part of the portfolio.
Yeah.
I think for funders too, there's all these different funder dynamics and decision making. So historically, what we've always liked to think of is that we look for leverage, right? So we're making a grant and that helps leverage all these other funding, or we help complete it in a way that gets a thing done because our resources are finite. And so if we can help lever all these other resources, then, hey, we're having an impact, right? And then you get another conversation, well, how long are you going to do that, right? Are you going to be an annuity, right? Every year you're funding you. Organizations would love that, but then that requires the foundation to make a choice. Yeah, that's what we're in. We're in this space on a permanent basis or for 5 years or 10 years, whatever it is. So it's all about making choices, right? But historically in Syracuse, we had a point of view that, a lot of times we had to say no, but what we like to say is it's not now, right? So with finite resources, you're going to have to make choices. But we're also such a general public serving organization that we're not just one issue. We're not just health. We're not just human services. We're the arts. We're food security. We're scholarships and college access. We're all sorts of things. Early childhood, you name it. So that gives us a broad purview. We're not super expert in one thing. We're in a lot of things, which can make us a good partner and support organization. But it's my long and winding way of saying that, for funders, it's an interesting decision process of getting to where you decide to do your allocations.
As we get ready I'll give you this one before we close out of here, Peter. Broadly philanthropic, massive, at the 37,000 foot view. Where do you see philanthropy, in your opinion, kind of going? Is this sustainable? Was it a drop in the bucket with, hey, look, we're just trying to do some of this? This is a really broad question because it's individual, but broadly, what you're seeing in the spaces you are, where a lot of our listeners might not be, are the conversations continuing around this kind of sustainability, these kind of conversations, or for some of us that maybe think that, hey, this was a opportunity to cash in on some dollars. This was an opportunity because if I didn't do it, it was going to hurt my bottom line. Where do you see it going, the total wave of philanthropy?
Well, I think it's good to reflect on the fact that generationally we have a big transition going on. So you wanted to talk meta. We'll go even further meta. And we have a whole silent generation and baby boom generation that are beginning to pass. And there's a significant wealth transfer that will occur. So one question that's out there is, what will happen to those resources? People have the freedom to decide how to deploy the resources that they have. It's a fundamental attribute in this country. So how much of that will go to heirs and how much will go to community or to organizations? I like to think of the Community Foundation as a key partner in that decision matrix because we really specialized in helping individuals think about gifts through their estates, those kinds of complex things. The foundation here was built on that. So that's one thing, is the meta generational thing. Just like you're seeing retirements on the one hand with nonprofits, you're also seeing folks passing on. And so that brings up the question, will money made here stay here?
Yeah.
Or will it go elsewhere? So I think that's an interesting question. Then there's all these trends in philanthropy, right? Like power sharing and getting resources to people closest to the problem is a very current thing. General operating support is a very current thing. There was a time not too long ago where it was more of a tech bro kind of conversation around your levered impact and your ROI on your specific
1%,
dollars.
For sure.
Right. And I think that has calmed down a bit. But there's resonance of it out there, right? What's your ROI? And I think that now we've moved into, especially as a result of all equity conversations in recent years, we've moved into more, how do we get resources to folks closest to the problem kind of conversation. So and just like any other sector, there's trendy stuff, right? And that's kind of where foundation trend is right now.
Gotcha.
One more question. Two, actually.
Two? Double barrel. Bang, bang.
The last one's already anticipated, but as a new CEO here in Worcester and new resident, are there 2 or 3 things that the 206,472 people who live in the city and are all listening?
There was a baby born last night, so I just want to go ahead and correct your number to 273, please.
That could be helpful to you in your new venture here.
Well, first off, folks have been super welcoming, right? So that's knowing that the community has been welcoming. It's a 300-year-old city and people remain welcoming, right? I think that's like a super positive thing for me and to keep that going. Syracuse at its city hall for decades used to have a sign that says Syracuse bids you welcome. And I think you could insert Worcester in there and that would work, whether it's folks who are new here seeking asylum or folks or new professionals who are moving here like me and my wife. I think I'm trying to think about the best way to answer your question other than I would say that I have and remain folks have a strong affection for this place, right? And the thing that is new to me is the town thing, right? There's some of that in upstate New York too, but the historic, very atomized town thing is new, right? Being able to, how many towns are there in Worcester County?
There's 351 cities and towns, in Massachusetts?
Massachusetts. But Worcester County itself, right?
There's like 70 or 80.
Yeah.
Right. Somebody's going to test me on that. It's going to hear this. It's going to be like, hey, do you know? You got to know that number. So that's a lot of familiarity. And so one of the things that I'm conscious about is we are not just the community foundation for the city of Worcester.
The point. Excellent.
Right? We are Worcester County. And there are folks with confronting issues that are highly similar to issues that we face in the city. Or there are other things that are hyper-localized. So that's an interesting thing to reflect on and try to figure out how to work through. Just that there's folks love the place they are and they want to see it thrive.
Yeah.
My last question is, who's your favorite rapper though? You think Biggie's better, Jay-Z or Tupac? Who you think?
So I am a child of the 80s. Right?
So you run DMC?
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
So
Big Daddy Kane?
Grandmaster Flash.
So I am like about, I don't even know how to answer that. Because I'm the whitest suburban music, new wave listening dude you can imagine.
New wave?
Yanni?
Who's your new
Like Yanni?
Yanni? Live at the Acropolis?
I rock with Yanni.
No,
Linda Evans. Is he's still married to Linda Evans?
Ani DeFranco?
Oh, Ani DeFranco. Love her.
She's from Buffalo.
She's from Buffalo, yeah.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Honey's good stuff.
I was just listening to her yesterday.
You know, I mean, the last concert I went to was Elvis Costello.
All right.
Okay.
He's not a rapper.
No, but he's been around. He's done some
His
cross.
stuff might have been sampled though. We don't know.
Yeah.
Right?
Tony Bennett.
Tony Bennett's all right.
Yeah, he did a bunch of stuff. He did Burt Bacharach. No,
Yeah.
Burt Bacharach
That's
is
what he
good
did. He did
stuff.
Elvis and Burt Bacharach. Yeah. And then, so I do not have a favorite rapper.
No favorite rapper. All right.
I am a disappointment.
No, it's not disappointing. That just tells me I have an opportunity to present you some different artists that you might create a appetite for.
We can start a new Spotify list of shared.
I'll share it with
music.
you.
I need to broaden my horizon.
Yes. Yeah. We can give you the last word though, Pete.
Yeah,
with
please.
Your prepared dad joke. Now you did the
one
really
that you
queued up
came
a
up-
good one
I have two
on the
others.
fly.
I have
All
two
right, let's do it.
others.
We're going to end with that.
Boom, boom.
And
Calls.
thank you for joining
Thank
us today
you.
and being
Absolutely.
our first
For
guest.
having us, having me. Yeah. So the first is what do you call a short psychic who has escaped from prison?
A short
jeez.
psychic.
That is escape from prison.
Oh man, the setup here.
I got nothing.
It's a small, medium, at large.
Oh, psychic. In
Yes,
my head,
psychic.
I thought
Like a small,
psychologist.
medium.
I had
Sure.
this because
Yeah.
we were talking about psychology earlier today with
yeah.
Mario's daughter. So I
put that
had
in the
psychology
pocket.
in my mind.
Small, medium, at large.
And then, why did the bird fall out of the tree?
Uh-oh.
Well, that one right there that's behind us hit the window. But
Oh.
Because it was dead.
And there we have
Boom.
it. Pan into the sadly no longer living bird, Mario.
So my wife told me that joke when we met each other relatively early.
And that's
when we
that
met
was
each
the
other.
hook.
And I liked that it was slightly sick and twisted. And
Yeah.
so,
That was it.
I'm in.
yeah.
Oh, that's a good.
Thank you,
I like
everybody,
that.
for
Yeah,
joining.
thank you.
Peter, again, thanks for being on The Ripple Effect. We'll see you guys next time.
Stay with us. All right.
Like and subscribe. Make sure that you continue to follow YouTube.
Tell your friends.
Podcast. Tell all your friends. We want to continue to grow. We want to hear from you. Make sure you comment and all those good things as well. We appreciate you. We'll see you next time.
You're listening to The Ripple Effect, a nonprofit imperative with Ron Waddell and Marybeth Campbell. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share. We'll see you on the next one.